Shalom, I'm Cantor David Proser from Kempsville Conservative Synagogue, Kehillat Bet HaMidrash in Virginia Beach, Virginia. And these are the Torah readings for this coming weekend, October 10th and 11th, 2020, corresponding to the 22nd and 23rd days of Tishrei, 5781. This weekend, Shabbat, is also the holiday of Shemini Atzeret, and Sunday is the holiday of Simchat Torah. So instead of giving our regular Parshat HaShavua weekly Torah commentary, we're going to talk about the Yom Tov Torah and Haftorah readings for this weekend. As I said, Saturday, October 10th is the holiday of Shemini Atzeret. The Torah reading is from the Parsha of Re'eh in the book of Devarim, the book of Deuteronomy, verses 1422 to 1617, found beginning on page 1074 of the Eitz Chaim Chumash and page 810 of the Hertz. The reading is known by its first two words, Aser Ta'aser, and it's the reading that's done on the last day of all three of the Shalosh Regalim, the pilgrimage festivals, Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. If we look at Sukkot as a multi-day holiday like Pesach, we see the same pattern of 2 days of Yom Tov at each end, with 4 or 5 days of Chol HaMoed in between. You may be thinking, but Shemini Atzeret is not the last day of Sukkot, Simchat Torah is. And you're right. But on Simchat Torah, we celebrate by reading the end of the book of Devarim, the book of Deuteronomy, and immediately begin anew our annual reading cycle at the beginning of Bereshit, the book of Genesis. So you can already see that the Torah readings for Simchat Torah are already set by the very nature of the holiday. Therefore, we read what we otherwise would read on the last day of a Yontif on the next to the last day, which is Shemini Atzeret. The reading begins with laws of tithing, followed by further laws relating to financial and social justice, including the remission of debts in the 7th year, the Shemitah year, the sabbatical year. In the same spirit, the obligation to provide for the poor is laid out. Israelites who are concerned about the possibility that borrowers might default are warned not to withhold funds from the needy as the remission of debts in the 7th year approaches. Such behavior is deemed base in character. Israelites who enter into indentured servitude, perhaps out of financial desperation, may be kept as servants for 6 years. In the 7th year, they must be released. At the end of their indentured period, such servants must be furnished with appropriate material goods. The nation that remembers enslavement in Egypt is compelled to treat its own servants compassionately. Slaves grateful for such kindly treatment may opt out of the schedule remission, choosing permanent indenture instead. It's commanded that all firstborn livestock are sanctified by God and must be consumed only at his chosen site. The Parsha concludes with a review of the pilgrimage festivals, Passover, the Omer period leading up to Shavuot, Shavuot itself, and Sukkot. Thus, we have our tie-in to the reading of this section on each of the pilgrimage holidays, and especially on Sukkot, as we relate such practices as tithes and sacrifices to this harvest holiday. The Mafta reading for both Saturday and Sunday is the same for Shemini Atzeret and Simchat Torah. It's from Bamidbar, the book of Numbers, verses 29:35 to 31, found on page 936 of the Eitz Chaim Chumash and page 698 of the Hertz. Just like all other Yamim Tovim, the Mafta reading consists of the command to hold a solemn gathering, this one to be on the 8th day after the start of Sukkot, on which no work is to be performed. It also lists the details of the sacrifices that were to be brought for this holiday, and ends with Moshe telling the Israelites all that God had commanded about the various holidays listed in these previous Mafta readings. The Haftorah for Shemini Atzeret, the prophetic reading, is from the book of 1 Kings, chapter 8, verses 54 to 66, beginning on page 1263 of the Eitz Chaim Chumash and page 982 of the Hertz. This Haftorah describes King Solomon's celebration of Sukkot as part of the dedication of his grand temple in Jerusalem. On the 8th day, he let the people go back to their homes. This is in keeping with the theme of God's commanding us to observe Shemini Atzeret as the 8th day of Sukkot, in order to keep us near for one more day after Sukkot before we return home. Sunday, October 11th, is the holiday of Simchat Torah. It's a holiday on which we commemorate our annual weekly reading cycle of the Torah. On Simchat Torah, after a joyous celebration of carrying the Torah scrolls around the sanctuary with singing and dancing, we open the first of the 3 Torah scrolls that will be used. From it, we read the Parsha of Vizot HaBaracha, the last Parsha in Devarim, the book of Deuteronomy, beginning on page 1202 of the Eitz Chaim Chumash and page 909 of the Hertz. The Parsha consists of Moshe's final blessing of the Israelites by tribe, followed by his ascending Mount Nebo, where God showed him the promised land as far as the eye could see. The Torah tells us that Moshe died there at the age of 120, and that God buried him in the valley below the mountain, and that no one knows his burial place to this very day. He was mourned for 30 days. Upon Moshe's death, Joshua assumes national leadership. Moshe's epitaph is summarized in the last 3 sentences of the Torah. Never again did there arise in Israel a prophet like Moshe, whom the Lord singled out face to face for the various signs and portents that the Lord sent him to display in the land of Egypt against Pharaoh and all his courtiers and his whole country, and for all the great might and awesome power that Moshe displayed before all Israel. At this point, to symbolize that our reading and studying of the Torah is a never-ending cycle, we open a second Torah scroll and read the first chapter plus 3 pasukim, 3 sentences from the second chapter of Bereshit, the book of Genesis, beginning on page 3 of the Eitz Chaim Chumash and page 2 of the Hertz. This section describes the first 6 days of creation, concluding with God establishing the Shabbat, the Sabbath, hallowing the 7th day and resting on it. We've already described the Mafta reading for Simchat Torah. It's the same as the day before for Shemini Atzeret. The Haftorah for Simchat Torah picks up the thread of the story following the death of Moshe, as we read from the first chapter of the book of Joshua, verses 1 to 18. This chapter is found on page 1266 of the Eitz Chaim Chumash and page 984 of the Hertz. God addresses Joshua as Moshe's successor, commanding him to bring the people into their ancestral land. Repeatedly, God exhorts Joshua to be courageous, declaring that he will be with him as he was with Moshe. But he is also warned to be strong and resolute, to faithfully observe all the teachings that Moshe had enjoined upon them. Shabbat Shalom, Chag Sameach, good Shabbos, and good Yom Tov. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe.